Good morning, everyone. Is this working? Yeah. Well, I hope you had the possibility of resting and preparing yourself for the second day of this international conference, Fragmentation and Reconfiguration, or Thinking the City through Fragmentation and Reconfiguration, Aesthetic and Conceptual Challenges. We've tried to bring together in our program different approaches to this general topic about thinking the city, and we invited several specialists, and we tried to bring together different ways and different approaches to think about this. And in this sense, we invited David Kishik, who is the keynote talk, was going to do the keynote talk in this morning. And David Kishik is a professor, teaches philosophy at Emerson College in Boston. He has been working extensively on the thinking of Walter Benjamin, Agamben, among others. We read and discussed his book on the Manhattan Project, Theory of the City, which somehow imagines the possibility or unfolds the possibility that Benjamin did not die in 1940 and arrived at New York and did some kind of continuation of his Arcades project. So I think this is the cable. So for all the reasons, in a project that deals with fragmentation and reconfiguration and the city, it would make all the sense to bring David here. Maybe he's working on another project. He has a series of books on the idea of the imagining forms of life, and recently has been working on this project of auto-philosophy. I'm not sure if the title today is related to that, but I think I can imagine that it is. So the title of David's presentation is My Schizoid City, and I give you the word. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nélio, for this gracious invitation, and thank you all of you for being here so early in the morning. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, in the back? And I hope you could read whatever. It's just a bunch of quotes that I thought we could share. Yeah, I've been working on this project that I call the work of auto-philosophy for a few years, but then during the pandemic, this picture is basically a picture of my office and my bike and my coffee thermos and my bag and laptop. I went to this park on the East River next to my apartment to keep on working on that project. And as I did, that happened exactly 2 years ago, or a little bit more than that, during lockdown in the pandemic, because you couldn't go anywhere else. I started to make these connections between what I call the schizoid position that I'm not so sure that we know much about, even if we know psychoanalysis, so I'll try to explain it as much as I can. So to connect the idea of the schizoid position in object relations psychoanalysis to my urban research that I actually finished around 2015 or so when my book came out. So I'll try to do this talk in basically two parts. The beginning will be kind of like a primer into the schizoid position, which might sound a little bit unconnected to what we're talking about, but you'll see how I move it in the second half to talk about its implications to our thinking the city, as we call it today. Yeah, I mean, Freud himself made in Civilization and its discontents this connection between a brain and a city. He thinks specifically about Rome. And I want to make some kind of a similar connection. This may be a personal psychopathology that I both suffer and benefit from, I guess. I identify as one. But during the pandemic, I started to think about it as a widespread social norm, and I'll try to explain why the city, both before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and definitely the city that we're going to live in the future, is what I'm going to call a schizoid city. It's true about New York that I'm going to call the schizoid capital of the world, but I do think the implications are for many other places, not even just necessarily urban, but definitely so. So I'm using New York and this experience as kind of a paradigm for something much bigger than itself. I want to not really apologize, but just say, just note the fact that I'm not going to read a paper, and the reasons are actually internal to the subject that I want to talk about. I mean, I was just thinking about this format that we have here, with all due respects to those who do read a paper. I mean, I'm coming here and I want to relate to you. It's going to be a lot about how do you relate to other people and have relationships. And what does it mean that when you come to relate to someone else and you are here to relate to me, someone is coming up with this controlled paper that is written and then read? Why do we need this kind of control when we interact with other people? So this distinction between improvisation and control, between speaking and reading, between voice and writing, is something we can think about. What does it mean also to come to a conference about cities here in this amazing city of Lisbon that I've never been to, and then getting encased inside this room rather than relating to the city by being in it? What does that mean, really? I mean, in many ways, I think that both philosophy, I take philosophy itself to be kind of like a socially sanctioned schizoid institution, and the very fact that the academy has the same kind of twisted brain, I will call it, that I call the schizoid position. It's on, I mean, the very fact that all philosophy is done in the academy is almost like adding insult to injury, if you like. And I will try to explain why these are just like specifically schizoid defense mechanism, perhaps. Okay, so before I start really with the quotes and everything, let's talk about two objects. One of them is a book called The Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. And the second one is probably the most Hegelian movie ever made. I'm sure you know it. It's called The Devil Wears Prada. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound like Kishik, but let me stay with me for a second. What I want to say is the following. Let's start with the film. There is a journalist. She's coming to the big city, to New York City, with a very specific notion of who she wants to be. She wants to be a serious journalist. And she gets this gig working as an assistant to this kind of like a fashion editor, the devil. Fashion, by the way, Benjamin, is something that he called Madame Death in the Arcades project. And she relates to this Madame Death at the beginning, this negativity, this nihilism of fashion. In the beginning, she really resists this. This is not what I came to become in the city. And then as the movie progresses, she basically sells her soul to the devil, to her boss, and becomes a part of it. And that seems to be the end of the movie, but it's not. Because by the end, you realize that you don't really come to the city. I think that's the moral, to be what you wanted to be at the beginning. Again, like I don't come here with the sense that I know exactly what I want to say and how you want to accept this, or how can you change me and I can change you. Do you come into a city? I did not grow up in a big city. I grew up in a little village in the Galilee in Israel. Do I come into a big city as I came to New York City 20 some years ago, knowing exactly what I want to be, who I want to be with? I want to be a philosopher. I want to live with someone, my partner. And I'm still doing that today. And I don't know if that's a success story or a failure in a way, because in many ways we want the city to change us. We come to a city not even knowing what we want to become, and then we become things that we didn't even imagine possible if we come from other places. The city is supposed to change us. We're not supposed to change the city. And if this is the case, that's why the movie ends really with her embracing a new identity, becoming a self, and that's exactly Hegelian, because that's what he calls self-consciousness, right? I mean, at the beginning, myself is just an empty I, it's nothing. I only become myself, I only become a subject by relating to the thing that is not I, that is an other. I achieve self-consciousness by relating to a consciousness that is not my own. And as a consequence, I am split, I'm divided, I'm fragmented, okay? I'm myself and I'm not myself. I'm twofold within myself, actually, Hegel wrote one time. And if this is the case, then the self is divided in the sense that it is schizoid, because schizoid in Greek just means split, divided, fragmented. So yeah, the point of this paper, of this talk, of this conversation, hopefully, you can ask questions whenever you want, not just at the end, is to figure out why are we divided within ourselves? Why are we divided from each other? Or you can swap the word fragmented if you like, or split. Why am I as a subject sometimes can feel divided from the city in which I live, that I either love or hate, or indifferent towards? We'll talk about that, those emotions. And why is the city also divided or fragmented from the world around it, the country around it? These are the kind of questions that we'll try to make sense of today. So to start, let's get to the first slide. Let's read from this book called The Divided Self by R.D. Laing. So he describes this man who is this shut-up self. The shut-up is an important way of thinking about the schizoid, who is being isolated, is unable to be enriched by outer experience. And so the whole inner world comes to be more and more impoverished, until the individual may come to feel he is merely a vacuum. The sense of being able to do anything and the feeling of possessing everything then exists side by side with a feeling of impotence and emptiness. The individual who may at one time have felt predominantly outside the life going on there, which he affects to despise as petty and commonplace, compared to the richness he has here inside himself, now longs to get inside life itself and get life inside himself. So dreadful is his inner deadness. So one way to think about this schizoid position is to think about a life without feeling alive. It starts with the notion that I'm very rich inside of me and the world outside of me is some kind of a poverty of some sort, or the city is. So I separate myself from it. But if life is a relation, is our ability to relate to the thing that is not I, a subject relates to an object, then sooner or later I'm going to become empty myself and impoverished myself. So this attempt to kind of like come in and out of my relationship to what is not me, this in and out program is at the core of this schizoid position. It's basically an aversion to life or a will to nothingness. In that sense, the schizoid ideal is kind of similar to what Nietzsche calls the ascetic ideal, if you like. There are certain kind of similarities. Okay, but if you open like the DSM or some kind of a psychological list of symptoms, descriptors that often come up when we talk about schizoid individuals are the following. They're very introverted, self-sufficient, withdrawal is very important, unemotional, impersonal, indifferent, shut in, and ultimately deeply lonely. You may relate to someone that you know, but these things are all around us, and this is what we want to make sense of today. We can also think about two authors, just kind of like iconic modern authors that oftentimes are associated with this schizoid position. The first one is Kafka. Think about Kafka characters, okay, in all the big novels perhaps, and compare them to people from like, I don't know, Shakespeare's plays, okay? Kafka characters don't have a family. They don't have relations really. To think that they can love someone and be loved is very difficult. are they even human? You know? Both people in Shakespeare and in Kafka's world live inside some kind of a prison, but at least in Shakespeare's prison, there is good company, okay? But think about, you know, okay, there is an object that I want to relate to in Kafka, the trial, the law, America, the castle, but the relationship between each other are almost none. And the relationship to that object that is always lost, you know, Lacan style, is never going to be achieved, of course. Kafka once said that he is a cage in search of a bird. Okay, that for me is a beautiful description of the schizoid position. Think about the burrow, this little story of an unidentified animal that just digs deeper and deeper holes, tunnels, rooms, trying to avoid some kind of a monster. We don't know what kind of a menace or danger lies outside that leads the animal to dig these deeper and deeper holes. By the end, you realize there's probably no danger. It's probably not an escape route, but kind of like a grave that the animal is digging for itself. Melanie Klein calls this a kind of a schizoid paranoid position, and it's very similar to what we're going to talk about today. But also think about someone like Pessoa, okay? Fernando Pessoa, where does he live, you know? He wrote a little book about Lisbon, kind of like a tourist guide, but it's really dreary. I mean, can we say that Kafka lives in, we want to say that Kafka lived in Prague and Pessoa lived in Portugal, in Lisbon, but not quite, you know? They live inside, I mean, Pessoa for sure lives inside his brain. I mean, everything is a dream. He wants to create a nation in his own literature. He's totally self-sufficient, or that at least is the aspiration, that all these different internal objects, all these different heteronyms are going to talk with each other and be self-sufficient to the point in which everything outside him, outside his literature is I don't know, redundant in a way or unimportant. Okay, let's move to the next one. Yeah, okay, so there are really two characters that psychoanalysts that, again, if anybody knows these people, let me know. But usually, yeah, Ronald Fairbairn and Harry Guntrip are my Deleuze and Guattari. They are mid-century Scottish and English psychoanalysts from this tradition of object relation theory. That they're pretty well known in psychoanalytic circles, but rarely people read them or refer to them, even though I take them to be the most important people, precisely because they indicate why, if the meaning of life is relation to others, again, Hegel style, we will think about the schizoid who withdraw, who is shut in, as the worst thing that could happen to a person, okay? Okay, so he starts by saying at a certain point, Fairbairn, according to my way of thinking, everybody without exception must be regarded as schizoid. The fundamental schizoid phenomenon is the presence of splits in the ego. Again, schiz just means split, fragmentation. And it would take a bold man to claim that his ego has so perfectly integrated as to be incapable of revealing any evidence of splitting at a deeper level. We're all, from that perspective, to some extent, schizoids. It's all on a spectrum of some sort. But again, it's not a concept that we kind of know so well. Even if we know psychoanalysis, it's very different than what we think that we know of as schizophrenia. So let's just keep this in mind because, again, it's not just a personal affliction. It's something that, again, I take to be some kind of a social pathology that I want to make sense of in an urban setting and beyond. How does one become the schizoid person that one is? The answer for Fairbairn is something that he calls the moral defense. Okay, think about this scenario. A little girl gets to a hospital with a broken arm. She comes with her dad, okay? Her dad broke her arm, okay? He's an abusive dad. But what will the girl say to a doctor or a nurse that comes to examine her? She will rarely say, Daddy did it. She will probably say something like, I did it myself, I fell, or tripped or whatever, or probably just, I deserved it. So why do we do that? Okay, this is what he says when he says, it is better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil, which is basically also Augustine. Okay, there is evil in the world. Why is there even evil in the world? We're not going to say that it is because of God. We're going to say that we are humans, are sinners, and are responsible for the evils of the world because we want to keep Daddy good. Because it's very difficult to live in a world where Daddy is both good and bad, or Mommy. So we create these splits, and we have this perfect Father and perfect God, and then we turn ourselves into devils, or evil, or sinners, whichever you want to call it. But also think about the opposite move that we can make. Instead of thinking that, you know, the world is good, or the city is good, and I am not good, and I need to split and separate myself from the world. Let's think about the inverse situation when I think that the city, as we heard yesterday people say, you know, I hate the city, or I hate the world, or I hate other people. Again, like Lang is describing this, okay? In these situations, I say, okay, I'm separating myself from that world in order to keep my purity, my goodness, my perfection, or whatever you want to call it. So I call it the immoral defense, because it's not that I idealize the other, but I idealize myself as good. But then there is this line, perhaps from Hegel, when he says that evil resides in the very gaze that sees evil all around itself. If all I see around me is evil, if I go around the city and all that I see is shit, you know, then maybe I am it, you know? And that's why I was thinking about this line from Jean-Paul Sartre, you know, in No Exit, hell is other people. Is hell other people? And what is the city, you know, Shakespeare tells us, if not other people, if not people, the people, you know? But it's not really that hell is other people or the city is hell. Hell is the life of the person that thinks that hell is other people. If you think that other people are hell, then this is true hell. But it's in your brain. It's not in the world. It's not objective. But we can think about it and talk about it, okay? So basically, both defenses work the same. I mean, I need to build a wall between me and the world, or me and the city. Either the city aggresses me, or I aggress the city, or either other people aggress me, or I aggress other people. It could just be a microaggression, but in any case, I need to build kind of like a wall. I can build a wall here to separate me from you, or you from me, because in any case, I think that I'm going to defile you, or you're going to defile me, okay? That's the logic. Let's move to the next one. That's really the last bunch of quotes from the psychoanalytic tradition before we move to talk about the city. The first one from Guntrip is really, for me, some kind of like the mantra of object relations theory. We seek persons, not pleasures, okay? And that's a direct jab at Freud, okay? For Freud, we're driven by this kind of pleasure principle. Pleasures for object relation theory, and what is an object other than another person that you relate to, that you have emotion towards, that you cathect? What are pleasures other than signposts on the way to relate to other people? If I have some pleasurable experience with you, I seek first of all you, and then the pleasure or the pain will be a signpost that will allow me to navigate within my interpersonal relations. I don't just use you as an object to satisfy my pleasure that I have even before I was born. That's the difference between a drive theory and a relational theory, between Freud and Fairbairn and Guntrip, in a way. And by the way, both Melanie Klein and Lacan are still basically drive. They hold on to this hypothesis, this phantasm that we call a drive. Object relations people don't really think that it's necessarily, they're really though driven by the reality principle, by other people. And that's what reality is from that perspective, okay? Schizoid problems represent a flight from life. That's the second quote. Oedipal problems represent a struggle to live, okay? A schizoid person just want to stay born. There's no actually death drive. You just want to stay born because your attempt is to kind of like withdraw and go back, regress back into your womb, basically, where everything is undistinguished, unseparated, unfragmented, because there is no subject and object. There is no good and bad, okay? You want to stay born, you want to stay in the world, you want to stay engaged with the city, okay? Think about it in these terms. From that perspective, the Oedipal complex is good for a schizoid. I mean, I rather, want to sleep with mommy and kill daddy than I would want to feel nothing, which is what a schizoid ultimately feels, okay? At least I'm in the world, okay? Conflict from that perspective is a good thing, okay? We'll get there. Actually, we can get there in this, the next one. When you cannot get what you want from the person you need, instead of getting angry, you may simply go on getting more and more hungry, okay? You're not angry, you're hungry. Anger leads to aggression that leads to depression. Hunger leads to a schizoid position when you're hungry for other people. Love made hungry is another way of thinking about the schizoid position. You can think about it as social malnutrition or even as some kind of like self-starvation. And as a consequence, you cannot tell a schizoid like the Beatles, all you need is love, okay? It's pretty much like telling an anorexic person, all you need is food. Yeah, I know, I need love, I need food, but there is something that doesn't allow me to really seek it out and digest it and get nourished by those relations, basically. That's the last quote. Retreat into indifference. Think about Zimmer's blasé, okay? Is that a type of indifference? Retreat into indifference is the true opposite of love, which is felt to be too dangerous to express. Want no one, make no demands, abolish all external relationships, and be aloof, cold, without any feeling, and do not be moved by anything, okay? By the way, the Stoics are just textbook schizoids, if you ask me, okay? Love may destroy. And what is the logic of the pandemic other than love may destroy? Biologically, if I hug grandma, I may kill her, I may destroy her. Maybe she got COVID and I don't, so she will destroy me, okay? But it's not just biological. We have that problem with our ability to share and to have loving relations with each other. If we are afraid that love may destroy, again, from either direction, we're going to retreat into that schizoid position and therefore we will fragment from each other. And again, from that perspective, pleasure is not going to cut it. It's not Sex and the City, it's Love and the City. And we'll talk about it more. Maybe I'll say something about Jane Jacobs in a second. Okay, so finish with this psychoanalytic primer, object relation theory for dummies, and let's move on to the other stuff. Okay, this is a quote from Paul Auster, the next one, the New York Trilogy. It's a description of a 20th century flannel in New York. He says, New York was an inexhaustible space, a labyrinth of endless steps, and no matter how far he walked, no matter how well he came to know its neighborhoods and streets, it always left him with the feeling of being lost. Lost not only in the city, but within himself as well. Each time he took a walk, he felt as though he were leaving himself behind, and by giving himself up to the movement of the streets, by reducing himself to a seeing eye, he was able to escape the obligation to think. And this, more than anything else, brought him a measure of peace, a salutary emptiness within. Okay, we talked a lot about the flaneur yesterday. And it always kind of like, over the years, I became a little bit suspicious about this character. I think that we kind of like to fetishize the flaneur, the 19th century Parisian flaneur. We're enchanted with him or her, but usually him. He's kind of like the prince of the city, in a way. But when I read these descriptions of the flâneur, all I see is some kind of a disturbed, isolated, and ultimately sad individual, okay? Is he really moving? We talked about it yesterday. Is there really movement? Or is he kind of like a hamster on a wheel? Who does he relate to, really? The man of the crowd in Poe, you know, he's not feeling comfortable in his own company. This is why he seeks out the crowd, right? Why are you end up being empty as a flâneur? Why do you end up being an unthinking husk of a human being? In Oster, it's interesting that Quinn, this character that describes it, at the beginning he's kind of a flâneur, by the end he's homeless. And this is where I want to go from here, because for me, the 19th century flâneur turns into New York's homeless person as the paradigm of the city, but again, of this schizoid position. I'll explain why in a second, but again, before that, just think that you have a time travel machine. Think that you land in Paris in the 19th century. I would just want to find one of those flâneurs and just stop them, okay? And who are you? What's going on? Let's talk. Sit down, have coffee, invite me over to your dreary apartment, lonely apartment. I'll invite you to my place. Let's relate. And yet, I don't think these characters really ever did. And that's what really disturbs me about them, in a way. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is a quote from a first responder's guide to abnormal psychology that police officers and ambulance workers will read in preparation to their engagement with people that are homeless, essentially, in New York and other cities. I mean, what is the homeless other than an exhausted flâneur? That turns the constant movement into a kind of a standstill. The homeless person usually sits down or lie down because actually what is there to see or to do in a city if you're a homeless person? Okay, this is the description. Law enforcement personnel will be familiar with the homeless individual who wanders the streets alone, never speaking to anyone, neither involved with nor interested in any close relationships. It is likely that many of the homeless could be diagnosed as schizoid personalities who experience no pleasure in interpersonal relationships, avoid closeness with anyone, and engage exclusively in solitary activities. If officers were to engage such a person in conversation, they would find a very cold, detached, and indifferent individual. Again, indifference. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of both love and hate is indifference, okay? They would find a very cold, detached, and indifferent individual who would display little emotion, lack of affect, and would be unlikely to respond to any praise or criticism that might be offered. You can tell a schizoid that he's amazing. You can tell them that he's a horrible person. They don't really care either way, okay? And by the way, again, there is this chicken and egg problem between, mental health and social class, okay? If you suffer from this on a deep, a pathological level, and you don't have a good support system, economically, socially, otherwise, you may end up in the streets, okay? If you have better support system, you may be flown over the Atlantic to give a talk in a conference, okay? But it's the same problem, basically, okay? It is a personality disorder, but for me, I think of the homeless person as a kind of a economic refugee, okay? It's not a political refugee, but it's economic refugee. It's a paradigm of a modern urban life that has to do with a kind of a sense of abandonment. Again, this is all what the schizoid position is about. You feel abandoned by the city, perhaps. Is the city good enough? In the sense that Winnicott has of the idea of the good enough mother or father or caregiver. I mean, is the city good enough to its inhabitants, or does it, you always feel that it may drop you? The whole point about Winnicott is that the mother is one who holds. It's the holding environment. Does the city really operate as a mother city, as a metropolis? Does it hold us from falling into pieces, fragment, that is? That's the whole job. And by the way, it's not just the job of the city as a mother city or an orphan city. It's true of us as adults. Don't we all hold each other lest we fall into pieces forever? This is just Winnicott's language. By being with each other and loving and caring for each other. Can capital, though, care or feel or even love? And if not, why can modernity produce anything but these husks of human beings that are pitted of their own selves, their own subjectivity? Just a bunch of questions. Okay, let's go to the next one. That's this famous line from Jane Jacobs' The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She says, city sidewalks bring together people who do not know each other in an intimate, private, social fashion, and in most cases do not care to know each other in that fashion. And that sounds really cool in a way. You know, the other people in the city, beside the very few that you know, are neither friends nor enemies. They're strangers. You don't love them, you don't hate them, you're just kind of indifferent towards everybody. You know, 99% of the people in the city. But that became a thing that more and more bothered me, okay? To think about the city as a conglomeration of strangers. Think about a book that it actually came out around the time that my Manhattan Project came out. It's called The Lonely City by Olivia Lang, okay? I bet you read it. It's a great book. It's really popular. How do you become really lonely, though, in a city? It's kind of interesting that, yes, the city is this space of these lonely individuals. There are 8 million lonely people in New York. But why? She doesn't really explain it as well as just describe it. And the funny thing is that she never mentions another person by the name of Lang that we just read beforehand called R.D. Lang, that gives us a very good explanation to why people turn into lonely individuals, precisely because they suffer from this schizoid logic in a way, okay? I just don't want to take for granted the fact that we're fragmented and lonely inside ourselves, from each other, from the city, and the city from the rest of the world. I really want to figure out why we're doing that to ourselves in a way. And my explanation here is psychoanalytic. It's not economic or otherwise, but it can go in many different directions. And that's the thing. Let's try to think about the city. Let's try, each of you, think about your own city, not just as a conglomeration of strangers that you can, I don't know, have networks with and get things done and blah, blah, blah. But just the bunch of people that you really have close relationship to in that city. Okay, the people that you really love, the family and friends and lovers that you have. Maybe even people that you no longer have. They're dead or they broke up with you, and they're kind of like ghosts that walk in these cities, but there are still people that we connect, that we have true relations with to some extent. And to think about the city just as that, okay? And it's really weird because I didn't think about it, but when I wrote this book, the first chapter starts with me thinking about NY, not just as New York, but also as the initials of the woman I came to be with. So for me, the city has always been kind of like conflated with the person that I am intimately related to who's sitting here, but never mind, okay. Yeah, okay, next quote. That's the last one, okay. Okay, we talked about the divided city. Let's talk about, we talked about the divided self in Lang. Let's talk about the divided city, the fragmented city. This is a quote from Nicole Leroux, this amazing historian of ancient Greece, who wrote this book about basically civil war. And the funny thing is that civil war in Greek is stasis. And that's weird because when we use this word in modern times, we think about stasis as inactivity or immobility, okay? But why is stasis also a kind of like a strife or a movement of people, you know, at each other's throats in a constellation of a civil war, is one of these questions that really fascinates her. And she writes, "The city is a mixture, as long as citizens of all kinds mix with one another. Only the steering ensures the success of the process. Harmony is not static. If there is no agitation, we want agitation. There is division, the divided city, the fragmented city, the divided self." And she's actually referring to this famous anecdote about Heraclitus. He was in some kind of like a conference of sorts in Athens. Everybody was talking. The subject was something like civil harmony or something like that. And everybody gave their opinions, and then they asked Heraclitus, what does he think about civil harmony? And he just stayed silent. And he basically gave you some kind of like a performance art piece, in which he took a glass, he put water, barley, a bunch of ingredients, took a spoon or whatever, and stirred it. And he showed it to everybody, and he says, that's civil. He didn't even say, this is civil harmony, okay? We need mixture, okay? Stasis is civil war because we're stuck in our positions. We don't interact with each other. We don't exchange germs and ideas and hate and love, etc. It's a schizoid standstill, the divided city, where we're all kind of like shut in ourselves and are unable to even agitate each other, basically. This is why stasis makes sense as a word for civil war, because civil war is not just us at each other's throat, but us actually, basically how we were during the pandemic. But again, with, you know, there are so many indications that this is how we were to begin with, and this is how we're going to be even more after. Okay, last thing, it's a picture that I draw this arrow through. It's some kind of a procession in the 30s against Nazi Germany in Washington Square Park in New York. That's the last thing I want to say about not fragmentation, but maybe a reconfiguration. Benjamin has this line in the Arcades Project. He says, we are growing very poor in threshold experiences, which is, again, super true about today. You walk from home. Where is home? Where is walk? Where is leisure? Where is the other part? What is private? What is public? And do we have a kind of a threshold that we're able to pass from one thing to another? And that makes me think of all these arcs that you can find in every big city. Think about the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Think about Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Think about Rua Augusta here. I just went through it the other day. And think about Washington Square Park, or Washington Square Arc in Washington Square in New York, in the Village. What are they? Why are we building these replicas of these Roman triumphal arcs? The story is that in Rome, every time the army returned from another conquest, all the soldiers will pass under the arc. And by doing that, they will pass through this threshold. And in doing that, they will separate war from peace, a soldier and citizen, someone that can kill people with impunity and someone that needs to pay their taxes. Also, there will be all these bad spirits, even pandemics and otherwise, that when you pass, cannot pass, the path is too narrow and they cannot pass through symbolically when you pass through the gate. And I am saying this as a proposition for some kind of a public art project or some kind of a performance art. I do think that right now we live in this twilight zone when we don't know quite where we're at. Is this pandemic time when we have to separate from each other in all these different ways, or is this already peace? Can we come back to be with each other? And I want to have this kind of like a procession in New York and maybe in other cities. I'm not politicizing it. I don't know when the pandemic ends, but we kind of like, that's the problem. We need to figure out, at least symbolically, a moment when we can say, we can pass through this gate and we can create this threshold between these two splits, these two events. Yeah, I guess that you realize that this is also the threshold of my paper. I'm done, basically. But let me just say that, by the way, if you look at the top of the Washington Square Arc, there is a line from George Washington, and I just want to leave you with that. He just says, the event is in the hands of God. I really love this. It's really like a Heideggerian line, The ereignis, the event, is in the hands of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this wonderful talk, which poses so many questions also, and I'm sure that the audience is trying to Barry.
Thank you very much, David. Hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
No, I can, yeah, okay.
It's more comment or suggestion as well, trying to answer your question at the end. It's just when you began talking about shut up, just because I'm deeply involved in this person, but you might have already read him. Kierkegaard I just heard Kierkegaard a lot in your talk, because the word shut up that R.D. Lang uses is from the Danish word indesluten, which is the enclosing reserve that Kierkegaard uses if you'd spare with me now, which he used in The Sickness Unto Death as a form of shut upness. And it's no accident that Kierkegaard is probably one of Kafka's favorite writers.
Right.
So he really takes that. Of course, in that book, he also quotes Kierkegaard. And as a part of that, it's very interesting, because when you talk about the schizoid itself, in that same book by Kierkegaard, The Sickness Unto Death, it's an analysis of despair. I think this would be very helpful for your research, because despair in Danish is not without hope, like it is in the English or in the Latin languages. Despair is the word in Danish that he uses is fortvivelse, which, ironically, for such a Christian writer, it's a very secular contemporary idea, because it means literally doubleness. Fortvivelse, it's too much doubt, it's double doubt or double-mindedness. And he talks about how despair is when you have this schizoid kind of, he doesn't use the word schizoid, of course, but he's talking about this doubleness all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's fascinating for your project, and I think the divide itself is very much that interpretation of despair. And added on to that, it's no accident, of course, that Kierkegaard is a person of the city. Of course, a very small city, Copenhagen, like Pessoa, but he's totally inside his head, and he creates many schizoid selves or many pseudonymous authors.
Right.
So it's fascinating to see this kind of Kafka Pessoa lineage with Kierkegaard. And as a final kind of comment then, when you talk about what do we do, or what the problem, because for Kierkegaard as well, exactly agreeing with you, the opposite of love is indifference. Hate and love are very close with Kierkegaard, like very They're indifference is the opposite. So he really tries to go into the idea of love and action.
Of course.
Action. And so I was just thinking of your question, this is very broad, but you didn't really use the word capitalism. So maybe capitalism is the problem, in a kind of and the flaneur, which you mentioned. Kierkegaard calls himself a flaneur in a derogatory sense. He says, I make myself look like a flaneur, so people would like me, people would appreciate, and they'll embrace the aesthetic world. That's exactly what happened in the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre took Kierkegaard's aesthetic realm and made it into the existential self. But for Kierkegaard, that's the empty, lonely, aesthetic, very superior kind of self, but driven by ego and narcissism. That is full of lack, and it's the great city individual. And I just thought there were so many things in your beautiful talk that I thought it worth mentioning these elements. So that kind of world we're living in is maybe this problem where we need to get out, or we need to kind of break. We can live with the schizoid self in a kind of a different kind of way, embracing action and love, rather than kind of being miserable, you know, about it.
Yeah.
So very few points there.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a lot of great points that you make. It's before I read the Zenith biography of Pessoa, I read the biography of the big fat biography of Kierkegaard, and it's definitely all over the place. You can also read a beautiful book by Louis Sass called Madness and Modernism. So all these characters will show up, including Kierkegaard. Actually does not mention Pessoa, and that's weird. But I mean, I actually talked with Sass personally, and he basically says that, you know, all great philosophers are schizoids. The bad ones are obsessive compulsive. He's a psychoanalyst, but the good ones are schizoids. And it's definitely true about Kierkegaard, and I just want to say in regard to that he thinks a lot about, of course, Socrates. And the question is that for him is that in a way Socrates was still, for him philosophy was still just a life. Okay, something that, by the way, Nietzsche will not agree with. For him, Socrates was already sick. And in a way, it was good that he was put to death because he was contaminating the city with his schizoid ideas, perhaps, if you like, or his ascetic ideas, if he likes. But what I want to say is that, in a way, his point, Kierkegaard's point, is that when it comes to Plato, what is this other than a schizoid position? Socrates was still here, talking with the people in the agora. Okay? Plato suffered some kind of a great sense of abandonment. His great teacher was put to death by the city. So what does he do? He retreats into himself and writes all these dialogues that you cannot write unless you are by yourself with no one else around you, inventing these heteronyms, perhaps, all these other characters that were somehow historical but also not. And it's really just essentially a schizoid position of someone that withdraw from the world and believe in some world above that may be the true one, but not this one. And again, where it comes to someone like Augustine, where you believe in the city of God and denigrate the city of men, you see what happens, okay? What is Augustine's confession other than a schizoid text about a person that felt that these other people betrayed him or were lost or dead, like his mom and his friend, his dad he hated. And instead of that, he relates to this thing that doesn't exist, called God, you know, because God will never let you go. God will never drop you.
But the point is, for someone like a Kierkegaard or a Kafka, especially in your talk, it's to kind of, we can all enjoy being a flaneur, for example, but ultimately you have to break out of that position or accept what kind of place you're in. You know, the flaneur. That's why Kierkegaard talks about this. It's a beautiful word in Danish as well. Downdreamer, day drifter. He used the word, or ledigganger, light walker, which has an aesthetic strategy, but after a while, you have to somehow break out. So a schizoid position, he's attacking the schizoid, but
what is the aesthetic position other than one in which you're like a bird flying above the city and not quite in it, even if you're on the street level walking? And again, that's what I see in all these flaneurs. They pretend to be in the city, but they're never really quite in it, in a true sense of the word. Yeah. Thank you.
One question?
I think there is always a risk in your talk, I think. I mean, not a risk in your talk, but I sense a risk in your talk, always to slide into romanticizing something. I not say you do, but I sense that there is this.
Sure.
And to kind of, in a way, see in a too negative light the indifference of the city, because actually city, and then I will go in what we mean by city, because it is kind of, sometimes also yesterday that city is always means something that we take for granted, not only in like ontological sense, but mostly also in geographical and historical sense, no? So the thing is, the city, and especially I'm talking about modern city, the modern urban experience, has always been about indifference in two senses. Now, the indifference, like blasé attitude, blah, 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 but also being indifference. So getting out of the suffocation of homogeneity, which was the local, and everybody knows, like I come from a very small place in Italy, and everybody knows how it can be suffocating to be in a place in which you cannot be indifferent just because you have to say hi to everyone. Anybody knows you, and it's really suffocating. And the city is liberating because you're indifferent and you can be indifferent, and this is a kind of enlivening experience now of the city. So the first bit would be like how do you see the liberating dimension on this, and the other is to what extent, and of course I mean you know very well Benjamin, etc. So to what extent this dimension of the schizoid is much more systemically tied to a specific aesthetic regime of the city rather than to the actual city in itself. And I'm talking about a certain bourgeois aesthetic that born in 19th century around the idea, which for me is very important, the idea of comfort. Now this idea that you can actually find your own space, and
right.
And of course in this 19th century city, experience of workers, for instance, now was very different. And
right.
It was really packed. It
right.
was dense, like literally, materially dense.
Right.
So there is this dimension. And the other last bit, it's the other city, like, you know, the city not of the West, which is a very different urban experience. Is a much more tied to constant improvisation and interaction, because there is a different aesthetic, but also, and I was forgetting, aesthetic, legal and technological regime. No, it's much more tied to a dimension. I'm not talking that this improvisation on the other hand is not, because this would be fetishizing, but it's a very different experience of the city. So being indifferent there, it means having to interact, not being able to seclude yourself as you are in the contemporary city. So in this sense, to what extent, what is the role, as Bartolomeo was saying also, what is the role of this techno-legal aesthetic regime, which I call the paradigm of comfort, if you want, but whatever, to your position? So how do you historicize the schizoid? Thank you.
I think that if you come to the city with this, from this inclination, then you do suffer from some kind of a schizoid inability to relate to those. I mean, I have a family there, that's all my life, you know? You know all these like interstellar movies where someone leaves the earth and goes to the stars? For me, it's like going to the city in that sense that you said at the beginning. It's like they always leave earth because something is not right. Emotionally, someone is dead, they cannot handle their wife, so they go into the stars. Watch any movie about interstellar travel, you will have that element that there is something on Earth that is not comfortable, okay? For me, where I came from has that discomfort, family, otherwise, okay? So if you come to the city to escape these close relationships, your culture, everything that makes you who you are, that makes you not a Kafka character, is motivated by a schizoid position. If you come to the city and you find other loving, intimate relations, then you find a way out of it. But if you remain a stranger among strangers, then good luck to you and the city in which you live. But this is yeah. And again, I mean, you could be homeless and schizoid, but you could also be a bourgeois and schizoid, as I was saying. And I mean, I love my apartment. I don't want to leave it. A lot of people during the pandemic will do the same thing. It's a golden cage. So if you live in the city and you rarely leave your apartment, as a lot of bourgeois people do in the city, then the same problem occurs, right?
It's about the separation of you in the city. You're in it, but not quite, in the true sense of the word. As for cities that are not this modern bourgeois, yeah, let's see it happening. I mean, I don't know really. I'm not familiar with that as much as I should be, but I don't know. I'm just thinking about something like Shanghai during the lockdown last month. People could not leave their apartment for a month. You know that? I mean, is this some kind of a future? And what kind of pretense will we need in order to create this Foucauldian space of monitoring of each other at any given moment? By not leaving your apartment, or even if you live in the slums, you still need to basically carry some kind of a phone, somehow being monitored, and therefore always encased within your shut-in space that the powers that be will be able to use if they want against you. I don't know, there's a lot in what you were saying, but that's as much as I can go with this. Thank you.
Okay. We still have time. We started 10 minutes after the time, so we still have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. João Pedro.
Thank you. It was an amazing paper with a lot of very interesting insights. I was struck by something you said at the very end, when you asked when the pandemic will end.
Yeah, go ahead. No, give him the code.
So,
forgot his code.
Of course, I understand what you mean. It will be very difficult to draw, let's say, a boundary between the during and the beyond the pandemic. At the same time, I also feel that the pandemic as a shock, as a civilizational, existential shock, did it last more than a few weeks or months? I kind of feel sometimes that the pandemic was something of 2020. And of course, we are still dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah.
But it's a completely different experience. How do you relate to this?
I don't really like to agree with Agamben about this, but I do. I think there is a bigger problem here. I think at the beginning we were like, oh, we're not prepared for this. We were so freaking prepared. What is Silicon Valley other than an industry built by schizoids, creating schizoid devices of all kinds, where you can get shut in yourself and not relate to other people? All this technology was there in 2020 to be deployed for us to be separated from each other. I don't know if we can go back. I don't think, again, that this is a biological scare. It's a political scare. And I'm more scared of the lack of our ability to share a life with each other than I am of this little thing called death in that perspective. Again, that's kind of Hegelian. That's master-slave dialectics. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I don't see the future. I cannot predict anything other than the fact that if I look at the 2 places that I do know, which is the States and Israel, I am really afraid of this kind of civil war that Laurent is talking about. People are more and more fragmented from each other. Again, just think about the city as a space that is divided from everybody else, okay? So I call it some kind of like a collective schizoid position. Like, I'm just relating to you because you know Nietzsche and I know Nietzsche, but no one else does. So we're going to be together and create this kind of like bubble of sameness online, in the city, and otherwise. We talked yesterday about spaces, urban spaces and online spaces. And we will be separated from everybody else. Again, for me, this is kind of like a schizoid collective shut-in between samenesses, homogeneity in a sense, that will create, again, the textbook definition of a civil war, where we are shut in from each other technologically, biologically, ideologically, and I'm really freaking scared of it. But yeah, I don't want to be driven by fear, but yeah.
Yeah, just a very short question. It seems you don't really mention the works of Deleuze and Guattari and Schizoid, so is it, for you it's not relevant, or do you disagree? Or?
Yeah, great. I don't think that capitalism is schizophrenic. I think it is schizoid. I think ultimately their attempt to describe the schizophrenic is as this kind of like a wild child that breaks the symbolic order, and in certain ways we are the problem because we're normal, and the schizophrenics are the solution because they are free, they give freedom to their drives that society is, and the father is repressing in us. And I do agree with them in one thing, and that also relates to these other questions that we had. I don't think about the schizoid merely as a repression of thinking, but as a line of light, even in the spot. But it's definitely a philosophical concept that I am trying to not just say this is the problem. In many ways, I see it as perhaps a kind of a redemptive element in our society again. So the schizophrenic, to try to understand the schizoid position by thinking about schizophrenia, it's kind of like trying to understand nuclear power by only investigating meltdowns. A schizoid is a schizophrenic that functions. I hold myself together. I'm fragmented, you're fragmented, but we hold ourselves together and are able to relate to each other. Schizophrenia is, from that perspective, is the breakdown of these defense mechanisms. When we can ultimately get into this catatonic space where we either speak in tongues or we don't speak at all, and we are totally shut in from the world in this autistic space. This is the worst that can happen to us, but I think that, again, the schizoid position from that perspective is a way to live with this. There is this psychoanalyst called Devereux. I don't know if you know him. He wrote basically psychoanalysis of like as an anthropology. And he just says it out loud. I mean, we're all, the modern American European person is schizoid, and unless he is schizophrenic. This is the essence of our our place, our psyche as a modern Western person. So therefore, I don't know what to say about non-Western societies in that sense. I want to limit it to that. And that is really our biggest problem. This is why I think about schizoism as a kind of the definition of our society today, rather than schizophrenia, rather than depression as Freud will want it to be, rather than narcissism even. Narcissist always needs someone to look at him. Schizoid doesn't care. There's a huge difference here. Both, though, are driven by what R.D. Laing calls ontological insecurity. It's a beautiful concept. We're all ontologically insecure, and these are all ways for us to keep ourselves together because our sense of self is so weak, ultimately. You know?
Well, I have a question, but maybe we can. I'll try to make it quickly. It concerns the idea of everyday life and habits. A lot of concepts and notions around this idea of walking in the city or being in the city are related to habits and to ways of countering habits and being able to reach another level of consciousness. For instance, in the situationist or this, and at the same time, the flaneur somehow entails this possibility. And I was thinking about a remark by Benjamin when he's studying Baudelaire's poetry. He says that one of the things that the approach to Baudelaire's approach to the city is so particular and so rich is the fact that he was walking in the streets absence-minded. It uses the I don't remember the German, I think, Abwesen.
It is similar to what Oster writes about.
So, but and this is quite rich, and there is also all this line of work relating the possibility of indifference or being indifferent or being absent-minded as something that as also a political and a social in the situationist and so on and so on. So consequences and it concerns the way we deal with habits and with everything, because the city is also a place of habits, repetition.
Right.
And how does this concept of habit repetitions relate to this idea of
beautiful?
schizoids?
I mean, again, just look, if you can like trace your walking patterns in a city on a map, you will realize how you have this, what we call in English, ruts, which basically means that I walked in this path for so many times that there is a rut on the bottom of the trucks, you know? I don't know the word in Portuguese, but The idea is basically that we narrow ourselves. So even though there are all these other places that we can go to, our habits, our habitus makes us be very specific, and therefore the city becomes as narrow as the path that we decide to follow. And I think that the situation is we're missing something. Because, okay, they got high, and they went at night to walk in the city, but psychologically, when I walk in a city that I don't know, like Lisbon, there are all these markers. Read Sharon Zukin, she has a lot to talk about this. You see the cappuccino store, you're like, I'm gonna go in that direction. Why do, when you get into an intersection, you decide to go here and not there and not there? Okay? I think that psychogeography makes us make these decisions, and they are usually skewed. So what I end up doing is another kind of a performance arts or a dance piece. I basically walk in I do it once a year on my birthday. You walk in a street in the grid of Manhattan, and you get to an intersection, and then you have two options, walk and don't walk. You go in the walk. You don't jaywalk, you don't walk too fast, you don't walk too slow, you don't walk to where you want to walk, where your brain is telling you that you should walk, that this is your habits of walking. But you end up, therefore, finding yourself in all these parts of the city that you wouldn't otherwise. So it's basically a chance operation. You can do, if there are no traffic lights, just do it with a quarter. You can't go around the block. You have to choose one of the two in a 19-degree grid. And therefore, you can do it for hours. And I think that it opens up a certain kind of receptivity and openness to the urban scape that is not just based on your narrow way of thinking about what the city means, what it should mean. So that's liberation because, again, you're right, it's a kind of an indifference. Wherever is good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, wherever is good is a good way to finish. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Coffee break. We are running a little bit out of time, but I think we can start at 11:50.